Okay, I wanted to take a few minutes and kind of give you background to the source that you need to read and think about. So we need to talk about the two characters we're considering here. In the year 63 BCE, Cicero was consul, and his chief political rival at the time was a guy named Lucius Sergius Catiline. That's anglicized as Catiline. That's how I'm going to refer to him here. These two could not be more different in some ways, even though they were both politicians in Rome. They were both ambitious, to gain high offices in the government and on all of those things. They really were motivated by, well, arguably by different things. And that's kind of what I want to get into here a little bit, right? Let's talk about Catiline first. So, before I do that, I wanted to just discuss the background here. So, recall from the last video that Sulla had his dictatorship in the 70s BCE. He carried out all of these proscriptions, which meant that he rounded up, political rivals, had many of them executed, some of them driven into exile. He seized their property and distributed it to his supporters. He did away with a lot of the reforms that had been enacted in the recent decades at that point, and really tried to turn the clock back to a period where patrician power was unchallenged and really kind of unchecked, where there were not a lot of limits on what patricians could do with land holding and power wielding. Sulla made it very difficult for plebeian governmental offices or bodies like tribune or the plebeian council to really exert power in Rome. In a way, he tried to make it a patrician's paradise again, right? And so that's part of the background here. Okay, we've still got this intense rivalry going on between patricians and plebeians. If anything, that's more heightened. But there's still this current of reform and populism that runs through Rome that goes back to the period before Sulla, where figures like Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus and Marius were more about appealing to the common people for support and trying to do things to gain that support, like creating a professional army and paying them and things like that, right? So there's a lot going on, really, that we have to consider and this isn't just about these two and their kind of personal rivalry. All right, so that said, let's talk about Catiline for just a minute here. So Catiline came from a very old, established patrician family. There was no question about the honor that he held in the society, which means his reputation, as we've said before, that was bequeathed to him by his ancestors. However, Catiline was not the most responsible of patricians, as sometimes happens with people who kind of grow up, in privilege. I don't want to be stereotypical here. Maybe I shouldn't have said it that way, but I think the kind of spoiled rich kid stereotype here, that seems to be, or at least that's how Catiline has come down to us in the sources. He was profligate with the inheritance he received from his family. He spent a lot of money. He gambled. He caroused, it seems. Of course, all of this may be just invective created by his rivals. But nevertheless, there was, that seems to have been in his background. And he ended up, like some patricians were at this period of time, kind of destitute. And even though he had the name, he didn't necessarily have the money. And it should be said that the easiest way to make a lot of money was to hold high political office and then to leverage that to do things like collecting taxes, right, where you could tax farm, you could skim money off of the top, right? This was just expected. And so Catiline was in the position where, even though he's a patrician, he had to go to, we might say, some serious measures, right, to shore up his indebted position. He had benefited from Sulla's proscriptions. He had fought on the side of Sulla in the Civil War. He had received kickbacks from Sulla in the form of land seized from the people who were exiled or executed. And so he had that kind of hanging over his head. In the years after Sulla, that was not the best label to be carrying around. It wasn't necessarily a death knell to one's political career, but rivals could dredge these things up. And in Sulla's case, or in Catiline's case, this did happen. Now, he did manage to get elected to the position of praetor, which is the position right under the consulship. So this is a high political office in Rome, probably in the year 68, though the records are not absolutely clear on that. And as was common, after holding a position like that, this is the ad hoc system Rome had come up with at this point to govern its far-flung territories. He was given the position of propraetor, which is a sort of extension of the authority of that office, used to go and govern one of the conquered territories. And so he was appointed propraetor over North Africa, essentially the area around Carthage that had been conquered in the Punic Wars. While he was there, it seems, he got up to some pretty corrupt things. He charged excessive taxation and kind of skimmed the profits, skimmed the proceeds, as it were, and tried to enrich himself. And again, if he's indebted, this all makes sense, right? So that damaged his reputation. After he returned to Rome in the year 66, he tried to stand for election to the consulship. But some of the residents of North Africa, including some, it seems, of the kind of Roman administration there, testified against him and said that he, was guilty of all kinds of corruption. And there were some other things kind of hanging over Catiline. And so the authorities, the powers that be, did not let him stand for the consulship. He was not able to enter that election. And in fact, he was put on trial for his corrupt activities. This was not unusual. This happened often to patricians, especially after they filled governorships. There were always always kind of accusations about corruption. Catiline had some powerful friends, including Crassus, who was at the time perhaps the wealthiest man in Rome. And with the support of Crassus, he also, it seems, enjoyed some of the support of Julius Caesar, who was not exactly Crassus's lapdog at this point, but he was allied with Crassus, and Crassus is the one writing the checks. Caesar had not amassed tremendous wealth. He would, of course, later do that. And so with the support of people like Crassus and probably Caesar, Catiline was acquitted. Okay. And, after a year or so passed, then he decided that he was going to stand for consulship again. He tried this in the year 64. Elections happened in the middle of the year for the consulship for the following year, right? So he tried for election in 64 to be elected to be consul in 63. And he ran against, there were 4 candidates for 2 consul positions. One of the other candidates was Cicero, which would have galled Catiline in a number of ways. We'll talk about, Cicero and his standing in just a second here. He lost, and he lost to Cicero. And this did not sit well with him, okay? So in the following year, when Cicero was consul, Catiline stood for election again. And once again, partly because Cicero himself, as consul, opposed Catiline and spoke actively and publicly against him, and Cicero was a brilliant orator, Catiline lost the election again. So he had tried at this point 3 times to become consul. Okay. I should say he campaigned on a kind of platform of debt forgiveness. Now, you can probably put 2 and 2 together and figure out why, right? He himself was deeply indebted. He surrounded himself with supporters who were in similar positions, including a lot of other patricians who had been profligate with their inheritances. And so, that debt forgiveness thing was quite popular with a lot of plebeians who were also deeply in debt. And so he is more of the, populist, he's taking more of a populist strategy to this. Cicero, ironically, despite being a plebeian and a novus homo, was more of the defender of the status quo and the traditional way. And so this, this led to the growing rivalry between these two. After he lost the election of the consulship in the year 63, he then started to organize what seems to have been an armed rebellion. Okay, at least he got some people on his side. They went out. Some of them went out in the countryside and started massing a potential army there and gathering weapons and things like that. It's uncertain whether Catiline truly intended to go through with this. But unfortunately for him, Cicero, through a network of spies that he commanded as the consul, found out about this, and that's what leads to the speeches. Now, let's back up a minute here and talk about Cicero. Okay. Cicero was in his early 40s when all of this was going down. In fact, he was exactly 42 years old. That's easy to remember because when Sulla had been dictator, he made it. He established age limits on when people could run for political office, and 42 was the youngest a man could run for the position of consul. And Cicero brags about attaining the consulship in the earliest possible year that he could do it, which means he was exactly 42 years old. All right, so just to establish kind of his age here. Probably about the same age as Catiline. Well, he's a little bit younger than Catiline. Cicero was a novus homo. That means that no one in his family previous to this time had ever held high political office in Rome, certainly not the consulship. No one had been a member of the Senate. By virtue of being elected to some magistrate offices, Cicero had made his way into the Senate. He didn't have to be consul, he had to be elected as quaestor, which is a lower office, and it seems he was that earlier in his life. But Cicero, his greatest kind of accomplishment and the thing that endeared him, especially to patricians, was his law career. He had been an able defender, usually of very privileged, often mostly patrician clients. Law career, this doesn't mean that he had like a law office that people went into and paid him fees. Legal, or I should say court cases were sort of public affairs, and anyone could show up and speak either for or against the defendant. They would often contract with people who were good speakers to come and speak in their behalf, right? Whether they're the plaintiff or the defendant in the case. Cicero had developed these oratory skills that were unparalleled in Rome at the time. He was a brilliant speaker, and he parlayed that into a law career and probably a lot of kickbacks from privileged people, wealthy people. And this helped to grow his popularity such that he pursued the consulship in the year 63, was elected. He did claim, by the way, the year 64 he was elected, for the year 63 as consul. Hopefully that makes sense, right? You're counting backwards. This is BCE. Cicero claimed that Catiline, during the election and immediately thereafter, had plotted to kill him. Whether that's true or not, who knows, right? He doesn't exactly give a lot of evidence for this in any of his speeches. Was Catiline really like that or not? This is a point that I suppose could be debated. Many historians have tried to read between the lines and say Catiline actually wasn't that bad a person, that the ideas we have about him are framed by his political opponents who were trying to smear him entirely. Okay, so he was consul in the year 63. Again, he spoke out against Catiline. Catiline would have hated Cicero for a number of reasons. One, he lost the election to him. Two, he was a novus homo, but he defeated this blue-blooded patrician, and that would have galled him almost certainly. And so these two men did not like each other, and that's pretty obvious from the way that Cicero speaks about him. The other thing that we should say about Cicero is that he later in his life, and one wonders where he was with this in the year 63 when he was still kind of actively involved in politics. But he mellowed later, anyway, we don't need to get into his later life. But Cicero became an outspoken advocate for the philosophy known as Stoicism. Now, the word Stoicism means, the meaning today is different than what it meant in the ancient world. Stoicism was a philosophy that said that the universe effectively is chaos, and that to find meaning in the universe, one must attach oneself to something, to some cause or something that is permanent. And this was beautiful for the Romans. They particularly enjoyed this because their duty that they felt toward the Republic seemed to dovetail very easily with Stoicism. So Stoicism was a popular philosophy. We might just say an approach to life, right? This isn't a systematic philosophy like we see with Plato or Aristotle or somebody like that. This is a kind of life approach. Epicureanism was another one, and there were some prominent Roman Epicureans, not least Julius Caesar. But Stoicism was one that appealed to a lot of Romans. And Cicero presents himself really as a Stoic, becomes an advocate for Stoic philosophy. And he draws that into conversations that he has, into these speeches that we'll read. I'll point out some examples of that. Last point that I'll make here in this video. What we're dealing with in looking at this conspiracy, looking at the competition between these two individuals, are what we might call the dynamics of honor and power, right? Catiline had honor. He came from a patrician family and by inheritance would have been honorable, right? Would have had that reputation. Cicero really didn't. As a novus homo, he was always playing with a few cards short of a good hand, so to speak, right? Sorry for the bad metaphor there. But patricians would not have trusted him simply because of his background. Some were his friends, and he defended some of them in court. But when it came down to it, being a patrician, being from an old family meant a lot. And so Cicero, as a novus homo, lacked honor. So the question we have to ask is, okay, what did Catiline lack? Well, I think the obvious answer is he had honor, but he lacked power. He could not get elected to the consulship. And so what do you do if you can't get elected to the consulship, if you can't attain power through the traditional means? Well, figures like Marius and especially Sulla had shown that if you have an army, and that may be what this rebellion was Catiline's attempt to kind of put together a client army. If you have an army, you can leverage that and force Rome to do your bidding. And so Catiline seems to have been going down a path that was similar to what Sulla had done before him. And that's when everything kind of erupted late in the year 63. This is just a couple of weeks before Cicero was ending his term as consul. He finds out about all of this and sees an opportunity to gain honor by overcoming a foe who was threatening the Republic, right? You could not ask for a more dream scenario for a politician in Rome than to have a crisis that you navigate Rome through. That was what Cicero wanted. That's how he presents himself as a great champion of Rome. And we'll look at the speeches in the next video.